What happens when a president discovers that one thing he cannot simply order away is a federal judge? Because right now, Donald Trump is running into a problem that has followed his administration from the very beginning. The courts can still say no. And this time, the story isn't simply about another legal setback, it is about something much bigger. A federal judge who ruled against the Trump administration has now spoken publicly about the extraordinary threats that followed. Threats so disturbing that they went beyond political criticism. And at the same time, judges across the country are increasingly warning that attacks on the judiciary are creating a dangerous environment for the people responsible for enforcing the law. This raises a question that Washington can no longer avoid. What happens when political power begins treating judicial independence as the enemy? And why are some judges now pushing back harder than ever? Stay with me, because the answer reveals something much bigger than one Trump ruling. The battle is no longer just about one case. For years, Trump's relationship with the judiciary has been intensely confrontational. When a judge blocks one of his policies, Trump and his allies frequently describe the decision as politically motivated. When an appeals court upholds the restriction, the fight moves upward. And when the Supreme Court becomes involved, the stakes become enormous. But there is an important distinction. A president can criticize a ruling, a lawyer can appeal it, a political party can campaign against it. But the legal system depends on something much more basic. The parties involved have to respect the court's authority while the case moves through the system. That is the constitutional pressure point. And this is exactly where the latest confrontation becomes so significant, because federal judges aren't simply complaining about losing cases. Some are now talking about what happens after they issue rulings, and that is where the story becomes genuinely alarming. The judge who became a target. One of the central figures is Chief U.S. District Judge John McConnell of Rhode Island. McConnell has been at the center of several legal battles involving Trump administration policies. In 2025, he blocked the administration's attempt to freeze huge amounts of federal funding. The administration challenged his authority and appealed. But McConnell maintained that court orders had to be followed. That wasn't a political statement, it was the basic function of a federal court, and the consequences were extraordinary. According to reporting published this month, McConnell says he received multiple credible death threats after ruling against the Trump administration. One incident was particularly disturbing. A pizza was sent to his home under the name of Daniel Anderl, the son of federal judge Esther Salas, who was murdered in 2020 after a gunman targeted her family. McConnell later described the incident as deeply disturbing. Think about that for a second. A judge makes a ruling. People disagree with the ruling. And then someone sends a message invoking the name of a judge's family member who was actually murdered. That is no longer ordinary political disagreement. That is intimidation. And it shows why judges are increasingly worried about where political rhetoric can lead. Why this matters to every president. Now, here's the part that often gets lost in the political shouting. This isn't fundamentally about whether you support Trump. It isn't fundamentally about whether you oppose Trump. It is about what happens when the person holding the most powerful elected office in the country clashes with another branch of government. The United States doesn't operate under a system where the president gets the final word on everything. Congress writes laws, the executive branch enforces them, and courts determine what those laws mean and whether government actions comply with the Constitution. That's the basic structure. And that means judges are sometimes going to make decisions presidents hate. Sometimes they'll make decisions Democrats hate. Sometimes Republicans will hate them. That's the system. But the system becomes much more fragile if judges begin believing that ruling against a president could put their families in danger. And that is precisely why Judge McConnell's story has attracted so much attention. Because the issue isn't simply, did Trump lose another case? The deeper issue is, can a judge make an unpopular ruling without becoming a political target? Trump's bigger legal problem, and this is where the latest developments connect to a much larger pattern. Trump's second administration has faced repeated judicial challenges. Reuters recently reviewed dozens of federal court rulings involving the administration's policies, and found that judges had ruled against the government on First Amendment issues in numerous cases. Some decisions were later modified or overturned, others remain in effect. The important point is that the courts are actively testing the boundaries of executive power, and that means Trump's legal strategy has increasingly depended on appeals. The administration can lose at the district court level. It can appeal, it can ask an appeals court to intervene, it can ultimately seek Supreme Court review. That's normal. But the sheer number of battles creates another problem. The administration cannot simply treat every unfavorable ruling as illegitimate, because if it does, then the appeals process itself starts losing meaning. You don't appeal because the judge has no authority. You appeal because you believe the judge got the law wrong. That's a very different argument. The White House ballroom fight, and then came another extraordinary court confrontation. The Trump administration's controversial White House ballroom project was halted by a federal appeals court. The project has been estimated at around $400 million. Trump has described the ballroom as an important addition to the White House complex. But opponents argued that the administration could not simply move forward without following the legal and congressional requirements governing changes to the historic property. The appeals court sided with those challengers. The court's decision means construction cannot simply continue as though the dispute doesn't exist, and Trump responded by signaling that he would appeal. Again, that's the legal process, but the significance goes beyond the ballroom itself, because the dispute asks a much bigger question. How much unilateral authority does a president have over government property? And the answer matters regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. If presidents can simply bypass legal restrictions because they believe their project is important enough, then the restrictions aren't really restrictions. That's precisely why courts exist. But now let's return to the judges, because the most important development isn't actually another ruling. It is the increasingly public concern coming from judges themselves. Federal Judge Esther Salas has spoken publicly about the dangers judges and their families face, and Judge McConnell's account has added another dimension to that warning. These aren't abstract fears. Judges know what has happened when threats against the judiciary become real-world violence. Salas knows this personally. Her son, Daniel Onderl, was killed in the 2020 attack on her home. That history makes the current discussion particularly serious, because judicial independence isn't protected merely by constitutional language. It also depends on judges being able to do their jobs without being terrorized. And when judges start asking for greater security because of threats connected to their rulings, America should pay attention, not because judges should be above criticism. They shouldn't. Judges make mistakes. Judges can be challenged. Judges can be appealed, but disagreement cannot become intimidation. Trump and his allies have repeatedly argued that some judges are overreaching, and there is a legitimate legal debate here. Federal courts have enormous power. Questions surrounding nationwide injunctions, executive authority, and judicial review are very real constitutional issues. The Supreme Court itself has narrowed the circumstances under which lower courts can issue universal injunctions. So this isn't a simple story where one side is always correct. There are serious arguments about the limits of judicial power. But here's the critical distinction. You can argue that a judge is wrong without arguing that judges should be ignored. You can appeal, you can ask Congress to change the law, you can challenge precedent, you can take the issue to the Supreme Court. Those are the mechanisms built into the American system. And that's why the rhetoric surrounding judges matters so much. Because when political disagreement turns into personal demonization, the consequences can extend far beyond one administration. Imagine a future president, maybe a Democrat, maybe a Republican. That president issues an executive order. A federal judge blocks it. The president responds, "This judge has no authority." Supporters attack the judge. The administration refuses to cooperate. The judge receives threats, and then the next president does exactly the same thing. At that point, the problem isn't partisan anymore. The entire constitutional structure starts to break down, because the United States isn't supposed to operate on the principle, my side wins, therefore my side is the law. It operates on something much more boring and much more important: rules, courts, appeals, precedent, constitutional limits, due process, and sometimes, frustratingly for presidents, losing. That is what checks and balances look like. Trump has spent years portraying himself as someone willing to fight institutions he believes are working against him. His supporters see that as strength. His critics see it as a threat to democratic institutions. But regardless of where someone falls politically, one fact remains. The courts are not supposed to be Trump's enemy, and they're not supposed to be his ally either. They're supposed to be independent. That's the entire point. When a judge rules against Trump, that doesn't automatically prove the judge is corrupt. When a judge rules in Trump's favor, that doesn't automatically prove the judge is loyal to Trump. The ruling has to be judged on the law. And that's exactly why the intimidation issue is so dangerous. Because once judges begin worrying about personal retaliation, the public can no longer be confident that the people making these decisions are operating under normal conditions. So what happens next? Trump's administration will continue appealing unfavorable decisions. Some rulings will survive, some will be reversed, some will eventually reach the Supreme Court, and some Trump policies will ultimately remain in place. That is how the system is supposed to work. But there is another battle happening underneath all of that. A battle over whether the judiciary can remain independent in an era of unprecedented political polarization. And that battle won't end with one ruling. It won't end with one judge. And it certainly won't end with Donald Trump. Because presidents come and go, political parties rise and fall, but the institutions they leave behind can last for generations. And that's why the most important question tonight isn't, did Trump win or lose this particular case? The bigger question is, can America's system of checks and balances survive the pressure being placed on it? Trump can appeal, his lawyers can fight, Congress can investigate, the Supreme Court can ultimately decide, but judges must still be able to sit in their courtrooms and apply the law without fearing that their families will become targets. That's not a Republican principle. That's not a Democratic principle. That's an American principle. And if that principle disappears, the consequences won't belong to one president or one political party. They will belong to everyone. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think the courts are properly checking presidential power? Or are federal judges themselves becoming too powerful? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want independent political analysis without the shouting and without the spin, subscribe and stay with us. Because this fight is nowhere near over.